Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you're joining from. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Isabella Pizzano-Rolla. I'm the Taxonomy Project Manager here at the Climate Bonds Initiative, and I'll be moderating the discussion about our newest report, Transition in Taxonomies. This report responds to a growing and very practical question facing many taxonomy developers, policymakers, regulators, investors, and issuers alike, which is, how can taxonomies credibly support the transition of a high-emitting and hard-to-abate sector while remaining science-based, usable, and interoperable across markets? While drafting this report, we noticed that the way transition is defined and applied in taxonomies, but not only, also in finance more broadly, remains quite fragmented, and at times, I must say, quite confusing. This is precisely what this report is intending to address. It aims to bring clarity to that space by identifying 6 core mechanisms that taxonomies already use, not always in a conscious way, to recognize and facilitate transition. But before we dive in, it is my pleasure to introduce you to our speakers here today. We're joined by Bridget Bull, Climate Bonds Initiative Advisor and lead author of the report, who will walk us through the key findings and framework of the report. We're also joined by Jan van der Morsen from the Principles for Responsible Investment and Venu Gopal Rajamani Venu from GIZ, both of whom contributed as reviewers and practitioners deeply involved in the taxonomy space. So a few practical points before we begin. The webinar will run for approximately 1 hour. We'll start with the presentation of the report, followed by a moderated panel discussion, and then we'll open the floor to questions from the audience. So if you have any questions, please do feel free to submit your question at any time using the Q&A function that you see here on your Zoom app, and we'll collect them for discussion later on. So with that, I'm very pleased to hand over to Bridget to present us the report. Bridget, over to you.
Sorry, I'm on a different machine today and I was struggling to use my mouse. Thank you very much, Isabella. And good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everybody, for wherever you are. And thanks for joining us today. We're really excited to share this research that we have been working on for a little while. And we are also very happy with all the people that have reviewed the report, and we'll be chatting to 2 of them a little bit later today. So moving on, just to give us a little bit of an introduction, why were we doing this report? So as Isabella said, the transition landscape can be sometimes a bit confusing, and there's a lot of different language used. And at the Climate Bonds Initiative, we had been, and similarly, our colleagues at GIZ and other institutions have been working on taxonomy development for many, many years. And through that process have learned a whole lot of different things about transition and how transition is reflected in taxonomies. And we, for a long time, have been wanting to articulate that and share that with the market more broadly, because we think that it has quite a lot of relevance beyond the sphere of just developing taxonomies, but across financial markets for taxonomy developers for sure, but also users and beyond. So that's what we're doing here. We're kind of categorizing and positioning the role of taxonomies within the transition finance landscape, and also a little bit debunking the myth that most taxonomies do not incorporate transition, because our findings is that actually pretty much every single taxonomy does. But we are showing through this report and trying to equip taxonomy developers, users, and the market more broadly with a language and a framework for how to think about transition in taxonomies, how taxonomies can be used to facilitate transition, and how this can be robust and effective. We also want to provide a bit of a common language for classifying what does this even mean? How does this work within taxonomies? And so to try and classify things a little bit better, and then provide guidance for the market, investors, and others in developing their own internal classification systems, definitions, etc., so that when they're using these, they can use this framework and assess how they can use these levers effectively. So kind of going maybe back a few steps before we dive into taxonomies and the kind of transition finance landscape, it's worth sort of sorting it out a little bit because, as Isabella said, it can be quite confusing. And that's, if you find it confusing, you're not alone, because when we talk about transition, we're usually talking about lots of different things. And it helps to think about kind of three levers that are needed for the transition of the global economy more broadly. So for the entire transition. And when we talk about transition today, just for the purposes of this report and this discussion, we really are talking about a climate transition. So a transition towards net zero across the global economy. The logic and the thinking can be used for other environmental objectives, a transition towards a nature positive economy, etc. The logic can be used, but for this research, we really looked at it through a climate lens because this is where the most research has been done and the most taxonomies have been developed. So it was the easiest really where we could gather this information. So thinking about this climate transition, there are kind of three levers that we need. We need to ramp up climate solutions. We need a rapid decarbonization of high carbon activities and a phase down and phase out of certain high emitting activities where there is a low carbon alternative and there's no pathway for decarbonization or a very, very limited one. And that last one may also include kind of interim solutions, short-term solutions that may reduce emissions in the short term. So those three levers are important. But the reason we're talking about them and some of the reason why this gets confusing is we use these levers slightly differently as to whether we're talking about transition at the high level for the economy and for entities, or whether we're talking about instrument level. And this is something that we found a lot when we were talking about transition throughout the report and trying to categorize it. This distinction between this bigger picture economy transition and then all the little bits that need to be done was really clear. And so we tried to show that there are a number of levels of transition. We've depicted it here. There's lots of ways you can do it, but from your very high level, the whole economy needs to transition. You can do that by transitioning different entities, which can be decarbonized by decarbonizing sectors, which can be decarbonized by decarbonizing different activities, which are then also decarbonized by utilizing different measures. So different technologies, different processes, efficiency, technology switching, etc. So that's really at the very granular, at the bottom level are the measures. And so when we think about transition at the entity level, the high level, we really are thinking about all of these three levers, right? Ramping up, decarbonizing, and phasing down and out. But when we talk about at the instrument level, usually the discussion, so when we think about transactions, about labels, about label debt, we usually really, the transition landscape and the transition discussion is not so much about the ramping up bit, but much more about the decarbonizing and to a less extent also about phase down and phase out. So it's worth remembering these things because this difference between the kind of the whole process of transition that needs to happen and then the kind of instruments and labels that facilitate that can create some confusion in how we talk about transition. So we also wanted to kind of think about then where taxonomies fit into this. So on the face of it, taxonomies are much more focused at that granular level, activities and measures, where they classify and identify sustainable activities and measures, but that's not where it ends. And so it is important to kind of think about, there are kind of two avenues for taxonomies to be used from there. So they can, for sure, be used for financial products, for green bonds, green loans, transition portfolios, etc. So that's on the one side. But they can also then be used and fed into and integrated into entity level indicators to track performance. And you see this by tracking of CapEx and revenue and OpEx. So we really are, when we think about where taxonomies fit in, it is at both of these. But on the face of it, the first thing we really think of is classifying measures and activities. So when we started pouring through this landscape, trying to kind of organize a little bit, we realized there were kind of two different challenges that we were dealing with. The one is that how do we, when we are at this granular level, at this activity and measure level, how do we define transitional activities? What makes this transitional? And now I'm really thinking about those last two levers, the decarbonization and the phase down, right? We at that measures and activity level, the ramping up, we kind of know what that looks like. But how do we define that? And then the second challenge is that once we've defined, okay, these are the activities which require a longer transition over a period of time. Once those have been defined, what kinds of criteria or what kind of differential treatment when you're creating screening criteria, what does that look like? And so this focus of this report is much more on the second challenge, but that kind of definitional challenge is what we'll touch on very briefly because it is quite important. And some taxonomies have done quite a lot of work in thinking about that first challenge is, okay, these are the types of activities that we see as transitional, and so they get kind of differential treatment. So on that first challenge, I'll go to the next slide. Thanks, Isabella. There are some clear methodologies, and this is usually based on the nature of the activity. So is it a climate solution? And therefore we know what that looks like. We don't need to kind of bring that into the transition that landscape that's can be labeled near zero or green or however you want to call it. And then for other activities, the nature of that activity is high emitting. And some taxonomies have a very clear methodology for distinguishing between the two. And in the report, we've put some examples. And on the next slide, we have one of those examples, which is from Australia. You won't be able to read it on the slide here because the text is quite small, not very easily. But it was really just to show you that there's a very clear methodology for thinking through which activities are seen as ineligible and which are seen as transitional. And the very first question within the Australian methodology that they ask is, does it have a stable or growing demand within a net zero world? So in the future, in a 1.5 degree economy, does this activity have a stable or growing role? And so if it doesn't, then it was seen as ineligible and not within this kind of transition space. So that's just one example of a kind of clear methodology that is given. In the EU taxonomy, certain activities are tagged as transitional. We give some examples in the report of how that's done. But the real focus on the report is on the second challenge, is what do we do about this? So there's a whole lot of activities. They're high emitting by nature. They can't easily be substituted tomorrow. And how do we set criteria for these? And one of the difficulties with doing this is that you have kind of static criteria at a point in time, but you want to capture a moving process. So something needs to change over time. So performance that needs to gradually change for certain activities, and static criteria. So that is one of the real challenges, is how do you do that? And that's what we wanted to try and capture. And because a lot of taxonomies are already doing this and in lots of different ways. And there are, what we found in the report is they're not necessarily good ways or bad ways or better ways or worse ways. There are, but there are ways that you can make these different mechanisms very effective. So what we call the taxonomy transition mechanisms are the ways that taxonomy developers are trying to do exactly this: recognize and identify movement of a process over time. That is the definition of transition, with criteria that are fixed at a point in time. And there are 6 ways that they are doing this. The first we called revision of criteria over time. So this is pretty standard. We see this in a lot of taxonomies. A criteria is set, usually a numerical threshold, but it's not always. Sometimes there are requirements. They'll be set at a point in time, and they're revisited every certain number of years and reviewed and revised downwards usually, so that it keeps the user of the taxonomy changing over time, which is the part of the process. So the idea is that you can't be in transition forever, you can't be stuck, you have to keep moving. And one of the ways of doing this is revising the criteria every 3, 5, X number of years. So that's the first one. The second is very similar to that, but instead of revising the criteria every few years, the trajectory is set at a point in time. So when the taxonomy is developed, forward thresholds are put out and published at that time as well. So you see this in Singapore, in Australia, and many other places. They say, these are the criteria for today. And in 2027, those thresholds come down. In 2035, this is what it looks like, etc. They're not necessarily set in stone, and they may also be revised, just like in the first mechanism. But the idea is to give some kind of clarity around what change is expected over time for a particular activity. So that's the second one. The third one, and maybe just to quickly say that one of the things we found is that these are not mutually exclusive, right? They often are used in combination with each other. But we just wanted to tease out the exact mechanism that was trying to facilitate change. And the other one is what we call shading, can also be called traffic lights. But the idea is that different ambition levels are put forward. That can be tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. It could be ABC, it could be green, amber, red. And these different ambition levels help to represent different levels of ambition. And they may be, this kind of helps the change. The idea is that you move from one ambition to the next. And again, that's the change that you see. It's usually combined with other mechanisms, and I'll get to that in a second. But that is the different levels of ambition. The shading is how that works. And they sometimes are, as I say, combined with revision over time or forward criteria. In other words, you may see how those shading bands change over time, but they have those shaded bands. And the next one, number D, is measures. This is quite different to the others. Here is where you have, instead of putting forward a threshold, like you see in the EU taxonomy, in many other taxonomies, where you say, this is the level of performance you need to meet. A white list of eligible solutions, technologies, practices, etc., are put forward, usually in quite a binary way. And these are usually automatically eligible. So in other words, the component parts of the transition are broken down into technologies and different levers and practices that are put forward to say, if you can't measure your performance, these are the things you should be doing. And so that is what we see. We've seen that a lot in Singapore and in Australia as well, and other countries have taken on that approach. It's quite easy to use and very applicable for the debt market as well. Letter E is sunset dates or phase down. This is definitely one you see in combination with others, and particularly shading, where you get sunset dates is where a criteria comes to an end. So it might be within the shading. You might have an ambition level, a tier 1, tier 2 is no longer eligible. So you might meet a low ambition tier, and at some point in time, you're no longer eligible if you meet that. And phase down guidelines are kind of similar, but that's where you have guidance for managed phase out. You sometimes see this with fossil fuels. And both of them are aimed at bringing a kind of phase down asset to an end. And so that's a different kind of change that is being initiated, is phasing down or phasing something out. And the last one is transition plan requirements. So this is where you have an overarching transition plan requirement, usually in addition to meeting specific criteria, but that activity, that measure needs to form part of a bigger plan. And that is the mechanism by which change is initiated, and that there is a bigger plan. Now, I don't want to go on too long because I really want to get to our panel discussion, but I did need to kind of tease these out a bit in detail, and you can read a little bit more in the reports on some of the detail. But over the next few slides, I'll just pick out a few points on, what we put forward in the report, which is how each of these mechanisms can be credible, and how they can be effective. But before I do that quickly, I'll just touch on one other finding that we found in the report, which is that many of you will know in taxonomies, we get different types of taxonomies, right? You get traffic light taxonomies, you get binary taxonomies, and you get a mix of these. But what we found with these mechanisms is that actually these sort of archetypes, these labels, traffic light, binary, etc., was not so important, because actually all of them were using these different mechanisms in different ways, and they were pretty much all being used by each one, or almost all. So what we found was actually it's these mechanisms which were quite a bit more important than the kind of overarching archetype in saying how transition is being facilitated by that particular taxonomy. So in the next few slides, you can read this in the report a little bit about the benefits of each of these mechanisms and how to make it credible. But I'll just pick up on a few points. So when it comes to revision over time, one of the kind of key things that needs to be effective and credible is robust governance for updates. So if you think about, if there is no update process, that lever, that mechanism becomes quite ineffective, because if the change you want to initiate is initiated by time and by revising criteria over time, if that doesn't happen, then it becomes quite ineffective. So that is really important for this one. And you also need some rules around when criteria change, what happens, and very good methodologies for defining starting points and for defining how those criteria change going forward. In the next one, which is the forward criteria, again, very similar, a lot of the same things, but in this one, the governance is a bit less important because you have these forward criteria. But what's really important is that you have strong, science-based reasoning and rationale for what that forward pathway is based on, and again, a good methodology for a starting point, particularly if it's based on local data and local context, then it needs to be really credible. For the shaded approach, and making it really effective and credible, can be a really useful approach, can be flexible for quite a range of starting points. But by definition, having different layers of ambition does bring in additional risk, right? And so that additional risk is that you can dilute ambition and risk delaying decarbonization. So that's the risk. To make it effective and credible, then you really need a strong methodology for each tier and what the boundary is, and very clear sunset dates for when they're no longer relevant. So particularly for low ambition tiers. On the measures side, measures need to reflect a really material change and that there's no lock-in. So it can't really be, don't really want lists of measures to be the 1%ers. They need to be, quite chunky, reflecting substantial changes and based on research. Onto the sunset dates. So, this is quite similar to the shaded. There needs to be quite strong guidance and underpinning for why something gets sunsetted and when, and based on what. It can be quite politically contentious, right? Defining a date by which something is gone. So that can be quite challenging. And so there needs to be quite a strong governance process for agreeing and revisiting these dates. Otherwise, to make it really effective, right? Otherwise, if it's very, subject to a lot of interference, then the sunset date as a mechanism can be quite ineffective. And it also should be combined with forward criteria. And then moving on to the last one, which is the transition plan requirement. So this can be quite useful. It has this quite holistic approach, but they can be quite high compliance efforts and can be quite complex. And so there is a risk of disincentivizing some no regret actions if a transition plan isn't in place. So, to avoid this and to make it effective and credible needs to be backed by robust guidance. And this may sometimes be in a more of a phased in approach. So, step one might be that they have a transition plan. Step two might be that it complies with certain requirements, and etc. So that kind of rounds up the main bit of the kind of the mechanisms and what we found. This just gives you a little table, and you can find it in the report again, to just give you an idea of there's a lot of different types of taxonomies on the left from a lot of different types of jurisdictions, from Australia, EU, Mongolia, Thailand, etc. And it just gives you a sense of all the different levers they're using, all the different mechanisms that are being used across these taxonomies. So you can see that they're all being used by quite different types of taxonomies. And that's what we thought was kind of quite interesting and that we found and hopefully quite useful. So some of the conclusions that we found from the work that we've done for, available for relevant for a lot of different types of people in this landscape. And from the developer side is that a really strong methodology around what is transition and what gets transition type of criteria is very important. The second is that, we've articulated these different taxonomy transition mechanisms. And so really use them and try to choose one that's appropriate based on your context. If the resources are very limited within your context, using a mechanism like a revision of criteria over time, which requires regular revisiting, might not be appropriate. So really think that through and be intentional and use that appropriate mechanism. Make them robust. So, we've got guidance in there to help taxonomy developers, but also to help private sector institutions when they're thinking of their own kind of frameworks internally. How do you make that robust? And there's guidance around the effective use of these mechanisms. And so that is really important. Align it with policy or guidance. So, we see this, we want to see this less and less, but you do see it a lot that taxonomies can sometimes be created on their own and that they are aligned with other policies and guidance is important, and that the mechanisms themselves may also be useful beyond the taxonomy context. And so consider also the relevance for other objectives. As I said at the beginning, this report is focused on climate, but the logic and hopefully the mechanisms will have a relevance outside of the climate space as well. And so we can start to think about how we do that for other environmental objectives. So thanks, Isabella. Sorry, I went on a bit too long. And that just gives you a little bit, we've spoken a little bit about what the applications are beyond just taxonomies and, thinking about internal frameworks, transition plans and target setting, as well as label debt issuance. But I'll pass back to you for the panel discussion.
Thank you so much, Bridget. That was a comprehensive overview of the report. And I hope everyone managed to follow the rationale. I would like now to turn to our panel discussion and bring Jan and Venu into the conversation. We have directed specific questions to each one of you, but please feel free to jump at any point if there's something you'd like to add or build on another panelist's response. Okay? So to start us off, I would like to pick on a distinction that came up repeatedly, not only in the report, but especially during the drafting phase, between transition as a process and transition as a label. So Venu, you mentioned a useful rule of thumb for distinguishing between the two, the process and the label, drawn from your experience with taxonomy development processes. Could you share that with us and explain why it matters in practice?
Yeah, sure. Um, One of the major emerging issues in the transition landscape is how people see it both as a process, but also its emerging use in labels. Um, so very often practitioners also tend to confuse the two and use them very interchangeably. One effective rule of thumb that we have found to be extremely useful is apply it to apply it to check if it's process or the label. If you can phase it, or you can sunset it, or you can hold management accountable to targets, it's the process. If you can price it and you can settle it, it's a label. Um, Wherever we call the label as a transition bond or a transition label, it needs to be based in a credible transition process. How do we check that? Go back to step one, right? Look at transition as a process. Can you phase it, sunset it, or hold management accountable to targets? Without it, it isn't a bridge, it's a risk. So any transition label has to be based in a credible transition process, and that's the rule of thumb. Can we phase it, sunset it, or hold management accountable to targets?
Thank you, Venu. That distinction is quite useful to help us identify which type of concept we're referring to, right? And especially how to best use it. But that's not the only confusion we found in the transition space, right, Bridget? I'd like to ask you, what is the main misconception you have found when analyzing the inclusion of mechanisms in different taxonomy archetypes?
Yeah, I think some of the main confusion, well, what Benny mentioned about labels and process is a really challenging one, and a lot of the time people are looking for transition labels. And so this is one of the confusions we get when people say, oh, there's no transition represented in the taxonomy. It's usually because they might be looking for something called a transition taxonomy, right? When actually a lot of taxonomies are incorporating hard to abate sectors, and they're using these different mechanisms to demonstrate the transition over time of these sectors. But that's not really what people are looking for. They're looking for something to label transition, whereas a lot of taxonomies are agnostic on what you end up calling it, right? So, in the EU taxonomy, lots of activities are transitional by nature, and they've put that there. You can see it. But they all fit under the same, they're sustainable under the EU taxonomy. So that's kind of, and similar in Australia, they did the same thing. They used it slightly differently, but they put forward, instead of having a separate transition label, they have measures that you could call whatever you like. You could call them transition, you could call them green, but it all kind of fits under the same umbrella of it being sustainable. So I think that's one of the big confusions that we find is that how the language around labels and what gets called transition, etc., and then thinking about this broader process of how activities and sectors need to change from kind of high carbon to low carbon over a long process of time. And how you do that. So yeah, so I think that's a big one. And then there's also kind of when thinking about archetypes, as you say, there's like a traffic light taxonomy. People often think about that being the kind of that is a transition taxonomy, whereas a binary taxonomy is not. But as we found, actually, a lot of different taxonomies are using these different ways and different levers. Transition changing criteria over time, bringing in requirements, taking them out, sunsetting, etc. And so just kind of using these different levers. And so the archetype we found was actually a little bit less important than which levers they're using and how effective they are.
I think that even the shading approach, right, Bridget, because when we think about shading, we think it's just traffic light. But when we think about
Yeah,
this progression, this inclusion, we see that in binary taxonomies too, when in some
for
agri
sure.
criteria, right?
Yeah, exactly. So in like agriculture, in some taxonomies, you'll see different practices for different types of users. So like advanced, intermediate, and basic, but they're not applicable for all types of users. So if you're a small scale farmer, you'd only be expected to use the basic criteria. But if you're a big, large scale producer, that those ones are not applicable to you. So they've used shading in a completely different way, to say a traffic light that we're used to.
Thank you, Bridget. So that leads us to the practical dimension of taxonomy development processes. Venu, from your experience designing taxonomies across different jurisdictions, how challenging do you think it is to define transitional activities in a way that is both technically robust and also politically feasible?
Inclusion of transition is hard, but of course, now we know that it is doable with appropriate scaffolding, right? There are three steps to it, the way I think about it. The first is the non-negotiable, right? So we determine the science floor or the ceiling, right? So we say, what is the country's net zero and then work backwards. What are the non-negotiables here? So in terms of design or so on. The second is the more negotiable part. So things like sunsets and so on are more negotiable, and it's the political economy dial, right? So the country pushes what it can want versus what it is willing to sunset or what it's willing to face down. Uh, those are the negotiable ones. The last is implementation, which is a way of your guardrails essentially. So we are looking at also determining speed, right? Do we want momentum and have some trade-offs in terms of saying, okay, some relaxation of DNSH, which a few countries have gone for, or some form of MRB or data collection exercises that can give you speed. Um, so those are the three steps. Determine your science floor, determine your non-negotiables, determine how and what you're willing to negotiate on sunsets and face downs. And the third part is implementation in terms of how you want to trade off for momentum. That's essentially how we see working out across countries from particularly a development point of view, and how we get involved and try to get countries to do as much as they can.
Yeah, I think those three steps really summarize the development process on how we actually facilitate these discussions with countries to negotiate. So thank you so much, Venu. Now, Jan, during the revision process, you also of the report, you also mentioned that we increasingly make the distinction between transition plans and the process of transition planning, both at the market practice and policymaking level. How do you define these two and their importance?
Yeah, thank you. And first of all, congratulations with this very interesting report. It grapples with a lot of complicated questions, and it certainly helped me to understand better. But I still have questions, but like we all do, I'm sure. So yeah, I guess I'll take us away a little bit from the more kind of technical discussions. And yes, we have increasingly in the PRI made the distinction between transition planning and transition plans. At the kind of the market practice level, the way we think of transition planning is the process that an entity goes through to define its strategy to tackle transition, in this case, net zero transition. Right, so it's an iterative strategic process within a company or financial institution. So they define, what type of governance structures do we need to develop our strategy? What's the target we need? How do we implement the target, and so on? It's actually, I think, in our mind, increasingly what really matters is that strategic, iterative process that entities go through, of which the transition plan is an output, right? So the output is the actual, the document, the result of your transition planning, and again, you review your transition plan over time. That's how we talk about it to our signatories increasingly. It also has implications for how you think policy frameworks should be designed and set up. Right? So maybe you would have asked me and many people 2-3 years ago, what do you need to enable transition planning? It's like you ask people to disclose their transition plan. And now we know that maybe that's not the best way to go about it. It may even lead to it just being a compliance or ticking box exercise without that strategic exercise sitting behind it. So you kind of need, and it makes it more complicated, but policy frameworks need to have like a range of instruments that will help companies and financial institutions to start transition planning. Right, so a disclosure requirement for transition plan is not going to work. A taxonomy, to bring it back to this conversation in itself, is also not just going to do it. It can be perfectly designed. It can have all these mechanisms in place that define and put the right criteria for what transition activity is. And that's really important. It will only be really effective if you create understanding in the market about the instrument, so it's used, and there is this whole piece of capacity building in the market, but it's also about how you integrate it with other instruments, policy instruments, right? So taxonomies as a way to show how you're implementing your transition plan, right? So connecting to disclosures on transition plans is one way. Having sectoral roadmaps on the site, right? That gives this forward-looking view on how sectors evolve, and then taxonomies translate that to the activity level, including it into labeling or investment labels is another one, and even into real economy policy. So I guess summarizing is that on the one hand, you have design of a taxonomy, but equally important is how you integrate it into your broader regulatory framework.
Yeah, this is something that we can't stress enough every time we say that taxonomy is not a standalone document. It comes with actually a constellation of other actions that need to be taken indeed. Thank you, Jan. So now I would like to hear from your point from an investor and portfolio perspective. Which mechanisms that you see here, the ones that they discuss, are more useful when assessing credibility of transition labeled instruments or portfolio alignment? And how do their use impact perhaps risk assessment and fund design?
Yeah, that is one that I've been struggling with quite a bit, and actually really came into focus when I saw the draft of this report. And I don't have a fully formed response to this, and neither does the PRI. But I guess the way I think about it's like you take the perspective of an institutional investor. They would usually assess sustainability performance at the entity level, right? So they will build an investment fund, or I would say even ideally when they look at the use of proceeds, that instrument, they look at how it sits within the strategy of an entity. Right, so the lens really is the entity level, and so to me, the obvious primary criteria is whether the entity is transitioning, right? And I think it's a little bit what Venu was saying before, like the entity level process should be in place for transitioning. So to me, the transition plan requirement is the most obvious one. Now, the report, I think, very well states that it's a high bar, right? And it may limit some transition finance. But I think some degree of entity level indication that the entity is transitioning, if it's not a fully fledged transition plan, it's kind of a science-based target or a CapEx investment plan that shows they're moving in the right direction is the key one. And especially if you think of CapEx, then all these different mechanisms, as long as they're robust and well designed, can also help provide insights to what extent the entity is transitioning in a good way. So I guess I'll leave it at that. It's not fully responding to your question, but it gives some thoughts at least.
Well, it's something that we discuss here too. We received that question before if we had a favorite amongst the six that we have identified. And the truth is, all of them can be quite effective or ineffective depending on how they're built and what kind of information is backing them up and governance processes, etc. Right, Bridget?
Indeed, which is actually one of the questions in the chat, in the quick Q&A boxes. What errors do you see like how can they be misused? And I think it's exactly that. If you just take the mechanisms as they stand and go, okay, deliberately in the report, we didn't say this is our favorite one or this is the best one or this is, they all come with drawbacks. They all come with risks, right? If you use this, and they all come with ways to make it very effective. And so if you just take them as a list and go, okay, they're all good, however we implement them, then that would be a misuse, right? Without the kind of the extra bit, which says how you make this effective, how do you make this credible, what governance procedures do you need, et cetera, et cetera. So I would say that could be a misapplication if they're not used properly with those credibility bits.
Thanks, Bridget. Thanks, Jan. Then, by any chance, do you have a favorite, or do you agree that they are all robust and effective depending on how they're used?
Uh, I don't have a favorite. Uh, I I think it's a matter of data availability in the data availability in the country. Um, Sometimes we can be surprised at how that comes through. Like in for an ex as an example, in one of the countries, we found a cement carbon intensity through an annual report, right? No, and the government didn't have, what its average carbon intensity for cement looks like. Um, it's an interesting way of looking at data sources, and your approach to it should change on what data availability exists. At the end of the day, we want taxonomies to be usable, and they're only usable so long as it's rooted in what is contextual within that country or within that region.
Thanks, Venu. And Bridget and Jan, and for the question from the audience. So I would like now to open the question to the three of you, because the report at some point refers to the principles for taxonomy interoperability. And those three people that you see here, everyone, are part of this group who are taxonomists, we could say, like working very, very closely, very actively in taxonomies, and especially in the principles design. The report refers to the need for a common language on transition activities, right? As all of you were involved in that work, what does this mean in practice for regulators and investors operating across multiple jurisdictions? So perhaps who would like to start? Bridget, Venu, or Jan?
I'll give it to my esteemed guests first, and then I'll chip in.
I can have a first go. I think I think what this specifically for transition, right? What this report shows again is that there is so many different approaches. And when we were drafting the principles, it was really hard, I think, to say something really concrete about it because it is much less established than just those taxonomies for sustainable economic activity. So it's much less clear space. And so, again, this report, I think, really helps to clarify this. I think generally, what we are keen to do at the PRI on the basis of those principles, which are very helpful, is to go to market. And I really try and understand, in our case, how are investors using taxonomies? Are they using taxonomies? If they are, what are the challenges they encounter in using them, opportunities, and then really think about what's next. And part of that is like what I said before, a lot of time has gone into taxonomy design. And now the question is like, how are we actually going to make sure that taxonomies generally, and transition mechanisms in particular, are helping us to actually shift finance toward the right technologies and economic activities.
Thank you, Jan. Venu?
I think of the principles as, this control range of what we would like taxonomies to be. So it has about 7 principles, and we're saying that we would like taxonomies to have those 7 principles reflected in some way. This report picks up one of those messy components in taxonomies, and a large messy part of it, transition, and then is saying how in taxonomies, it's dealt with. So principles are a more overarching view of our control range. This is more detailed on how transition looks like across taxonomies. Yeah.
Thanks, Venu. Bridget?
Yeah, I mean, I think also, I mean, the very concept of interoperability is kind of being able to organize and compare things. And hopefully this report helps in kind of classifying and organizing these different mechanisms. So then we can use them as they are, make them more effective, etc., and credible, and then they become more interoperable. And so I think there's that also intentionality. I think up until now, the work that we've been doing in the background researching this has been very much what are we seeing and how do we classify it? And hold on, we've actually been seeing similar mechanisms being used. And so let's, bring them together in a group and call it shading or call it X. And so, we now have a little bit of a framework. It's by no means perfect, and we will be, certainly iterating it over time. There will be, adjustments and, and all of those things, but it gives us a way to start thinking more intentionally about making these decisions. And then that then hopefully enhances interoperability as well. And I think, which, is an important part of the principles.
Thank you, Bridget. If you are interested in understanding more about the principles, we'll share the link of the principles with you. And there's also a podcast from both Bridget and Elodie from UNEPFI where they discussed a little bit more about it. But now, thank you all so much for those insights. We would now like to move to the Q&A session. We have quite a few questions here that came through LinkedIn as well. And we'll group them thematically a bit where possible. And I'll start with the first one. There's not specifically for any of you, so please do feel free to jump in. And that's quite related to that first question that when we were talking, if we have a favorite one or not. So the paper highlights that no single mechanism is inherently more ambitious than the other. Credibility depends on how they're applied. What are the clearest red flags that a transition mechanism risks becoming a box-ticking exercise rather than a driving real decarbonization? Any thoughts?
Well, I mean, yeah, I think there are red flags, and I mean that's why we put those kind of credibility indicators there. I mean, anytime you see a process where there's no underpinning rationale or research or data or whatever, and we've got a threshold potentially declining, potentially a sunset that maybe at some date way in the future, then there's a kind of bit of a red flag that that's been open to sort of heavy interference and negotiation and maybe not so much underpinning research. So I think that's a kind of a big red flag. It can be difficult when you try and unpick a taxonomy process to understand what exact research was being used, etc. And sometimes decisions aren't, put in exact detail as to what was used and when. But if you are seeing that, I think that makes it quite tricky. That is a bit of a red flag. I know, Veni, you had some when we were discussing the report, particularly around shaded systems, and you were talking a lot about, we had quite good discussions about some of the risks on that. I don't know if you wanted to comment on that as well, and some of the red flags you've seen on that.
Yeah. So across those six taxonomy mechanisms that you have, shading is among those that has been used, but its use can be a bit convoluted at times. Um, if you don't have appropriate guardrails set, then it could mean that it actually does not involve anything to do with transition, a credible transition, but it's basically just adjusting your economic activities in shaded boxes. That's not what taxonomy should be doing, or that's not what we aim to do with shading mechanisms as well. Um, but having said that, the question is also asking that this should not become a box ticking exercise. And how do we do that? Is actually testing it out in implementation. And that's where I think more of our efforts are also going towards, is to see what works on taxonomies. Development is one part of it. Let's actually try and test it out in markets and see what works, how are users using it, what do they need to be relaxed, what needs to be revised, what needs to be adjusted. Those are experiments that need to be done with real economy and financial markets and domestic and otherwise. And that's where more of our effort is slowly transitioning to.
Thank you, Venu. Any other thoughts on this one?
Just add, I agree with that. I think what we hear from investors is that they're very interested to have the long-term perspective. It's not so much a red flag, it's more like what is going to be most useful. And I think any type of mechanism that can provide that visibility over the long term is going to be likely more effective than something that people don't know what will change and when. And I know it's not always possible, and that's why these other mechanisms probably exist. But that's just the one thing like forward-looking approaches are going to be, I think, more effective and for the markets in terms of pickup.
Thank you, Jan, Benno, and Bridget. I'm seeing the questions that we are receiving here, and there are many of them who try to let us prioritize or favoritize one of them. They keep asking, many of the questions are asking, yeah, but which one would be the best one, and so on. So I'll give another one here. So for instance, measures and transition plans are often used as practical entry points where data availability is limited. From your experience, what safeguards are most important to ensure these tools don't unintentionally lock in high carbon infrastructure?
Yeah, the lock-in is a really big one, and it's something. So with the Australia taxonomy, there were a lot of measures in there, and one of the key questions that we asked of each measure, and we went through with the various technical advisory groups, etc., was is this a big lock-in risk? And I mean, it's difficult because it's very kind of technology and sector specific as to what kinds of questions you would ask for that. But some of the things you look at is this technology ultimately going to be phased out? So not the sector, not the activity, but is this technology, is it possible to decarbonize? So you might think of something like steel, blast furnaces is something that, as far as we understand right now, no amount of carbon capture is going to be, it's so incredibly emissions intensive that, the technology pathways that we know of, it's going to be very difficult to, reduce those emissions via carbon capture. So although we will see that technology for some time to come, ultimately any measures that have to do with improving blast furnaces, are they going to be locked in? And so that's kind of I'm not saying yes or no to that, because that's an even more complicated question. But that's one of the things we would ask. And the other one we'd often ask is, how big is this? How high capex is it? Because for something that's very high capex, you have a much higher risk of lock-in because you need a long time to pay that back. And so whereas quite small capex investments, you often, those will often be made and even if they're made in a technology that's going to be phased out in 5 years, sometimes that's not a big problem, right? So these are some of the questions that we'd often ask, particularly around measures, to kind of think about that lock-in risk. But it is a risk, right? And so that is something that, again, going back to that, what makes this measure credible? It's has this been looked at? Have these been studied? Because that is really important. I can't remember the other part of that question, but yeah, that's some thoughts.
I think that answers the question, Bridget. And now I'll go to the last one. We still have a few questions here, but I'll go to the last one. I'm conscious of time here. So from an implementation perspective, what role can regional or sectoral roadmaps play in strengthening the credibility of transition criteria where global pathways are not yet granular enough?
I'm happy to come in, but maybe my colleagues. Jan, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think a big role. And so it's kind of points I made before, and something we really hear very often from our signatory bases. The governments actually co-designing such sector roadmaps with industry is really going to help to create that long-term visibility of where certain sectors are decarbonizing towards, and the types of technologies that have to be developed to reach those goals. So there's definitely a very strong demand from investors for governments to develop those more granular and localized decarbonization and technology pathways. And so by consequence, those will really help to create those forward-looking economic activity criteria for taxonomies as well. So my response is short, it's like very important and lots of demand for them.
Thank you, Jan. All right, we are reaching the end of our webinar. And to conclude, I would like to invite our panelists to share in one sentence, one practical takeaway from the report. So Jan, you're the last one, so I'll start with you. Quick one, a practical takeaway.
Look at the mechanisms, not at the kind of, I don't know how you say it, whether it's binary or traffic light, which was very confusing to me, but just look at the mechanisms rather than the apparent design of the taxonomy.
Makes sense. Venno.
We can settle a label in T+2, but we can never settle a transition label without credible transition. How do we do that? Read the report.
There you go. Thank you. Bridget.
I'll have two quick ones. One is, don't have a favorite mechanism, have a kind of favorite credibility point, like really think about what makes them credible rather than thinking too much about, and what makes useful in your context. So really, I think that's one point. And then the second point is, I would say I've seen so many really good questions that I really wish we could have had time to answer. So please, keep this conversation going, because as I said, it's iterative and we would like to improve it. So thanks.
So thank you so much, Bridget, Venu, Jan, and all of you who are with us here today for this rich and thoughtful discussion, and for your excellent questions as well. When we were first drafting this report, we were like, oh my God, who's going to read this? Because it's quite geeky in the taxonomy space, but apparently some people are enjoying it and send actually quite very interesting questions. So thank you all very much. The report is available on our website right here, using the QR code. Translations in Spanish and French will be available very soon, if you would prefer to reading those two languages. And if you'd like to take this discussion forward with us, do not hesitate to get in touch. We love moving the conversation, getting the conversations going. Thank you so much, everyone.